In the previous video, I presented John Locke's theory of property. Locke describes the origins of property in terms of the fact that an individual owns their own lives and their own labor. If somebody attaches their labor to something and somebody else then takes that property as their own, they have, in a sense, walked away with a part of the life of the person who performed the labor. And this amounts to a kind of slavery. But there's some problems with Locke's conceptions of property that we need to consider. This video is concerned with taking a look at some of those objections. The first objection asks how one justifies the claim that attaching what one owns, one's labor, to something that's unowned makes that thing one's property. On Locke's account, if somebody were to go to a stream and fill a bucket with water, then they have attached their labor to that bucket of water and it's now theirs. To take the bucket is to take the labor of the person who harvested the bucket of water. In the book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Robert Nozick asked the following question, quote, "But why isn't mixing what I own with what I don't own a way of losing what I own rather than a way of gaining what I don't? If I own a can of tomato juice and I spill it in the sea so that its molecules, made radioactive so I can check this, mingle evenly throughout the sea, do I thereby come to own the sea, or have I foolishly dissipated my tomato juice?" End quote. Now, to some degree, this misrepresents Locke's argument. Locke never argued that all you need to do to gain ownership of something is to mix your labor with it. In the terms of philosophers, Locke did not say that attaching one's labor to something unowned is a sufficient condition for making it one's property. Locke had placed other conditions that must also be met. There is, of course, the condition that what one attaches one's labor to must, in fact, be unowned. And second, there must be as much and as good left over for others. This is a condition that Nozick himself gave the name by which philosophers now identify this condition, the Lockean proviso. And third, one has to actually be able to use what one takes and not take so much that it spoils. However, this really doesn't defeat the point of Nozick's objection. Assume that Elon Musk sends a lander to the surface of Mars. The lander contains several blocks of frozen CO2 that it drops on the surface of Mars near the equator, where it sublimates and spreads throughout the whole atmosphere. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which will warm Mars as it does Earth and make the planet more inhabitable. In doing this, Musk would have taken the first step to improving Mars, much like taking an acre of ground and plowing it so that one can plant crops. On Locke's account, one can take ownership of an acre of land as soon as one plows it, long before one can harvest any food off of it. So, would Musk be entitled to the planet Mars, or did he just lose a few kilograms of CO2? Let's look at another example, ice on the moon. It currently costs over $1,000 to get 1 kilogram of rocket fuel from the surface of the Earth into orbit. This is because one has to take that container of water and get it up to an altitude of several hundred miles and moving at a speed of about 30,000 kilometers per hour. Ice on the moon is already up there. It can be converted into rocket fuel just by adding electricity, which the sun and solar panels can do for us. Now, on Locke's principle, one owns the ice on the moon and can use it for rocket fuel as soon as one mixes one's labor with it. If one builds lunar mining equipment and lands it on the moon, how much ice can one claim? When does one own it? This leads us to another objection to Locke's principle. On Locke's account, oil that's still in the ground hasn't had any labor attached to it. Consequently, it would qualify as unowned on Locke's system. Yet in the real world, these resources are treated as owned. They are owned by the individual who has the mineral rights to whatever can be found under their land. In some cases, the government owns the resources and can sell it or sell leases to harvest it as they please. So, is it the case that we really should be treating oil and other resources still in the ground as unowned until it is literally picked up and put in a container? Or do we need to add some adjustment to the Lockean system to include some way of acquiring ownership of resources prior to mixing one's labor with it? Here's another problem with the Lockean theory. Even at the time that Locke was writing his treatise, people were making land claims to huge amounts of land by doing little more than planting a flag. In 1682, just 7 years before Locke's treatise was published, but at the time that Locke was writing the treatise, Robert Cavelier de La Salle claimed all of the lands drained by the Mississippi River for France, naming the land Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This violates two of Locke's provisions. La Salle didn't mix his labor with all of the land drained by the Mississippi River, and much of that land was already owned on Lockean terms. Others had mixed their labor with it. Even though this land grab was immoral on Lockean standards, it was honored. France gave the land to Spain, which gave it back to France, who sold it to the United States, and these claims became the basis for almost all current ownership rights in that territory today. Actually, it would seem that almost everything owned today can be considered stolen property. Yet we have absolutely no way to determine the rightful owner on Lockean terms, so Locke's theory seems inapplicable to the question of real-world property rights. Along those same lines, on what grounds can a nation claim territorial waters? Through international treaties, all countries have an economic exclusion zone that extends 200 miles or to the edge of the continental shelf, whichever is furthest, from their national shores. This is property in the state of nature that, in many cases, no labor has been attached to, but which others are excluded from using. And there has been no regard given to leaving as much and as good for others. Another problem with acquiring ownership through attaching one's labor is what has been called the tragedy of the commons. This is worth looking at in some detail. The term, the tragedy of the commons, comes from the title of an article published in 1968 by Garrett Hardin. Hardin's article explained how a resource that's held in common can be overused. He illustrates the tragedy by imagining a pasture on which anybody can place a cow. If too many cows are placed on the land, then it will be overgrazed and ruined. However, nobody has an incentive to refrain from adding a cow to the pasture, since if they refrain, some other villager is going to take advantage of the grass made available. So the pasture ends up being overgrazed, destroyed, and everybody starves. The same problem exists when it's the case that the only way to harvest a resource is by attaching one's labor to it. Buffalo on the American plains and fish in the oceans are unowned in the Lockean sense until somebody mixes their labor with them. And one mixes their labor with the buffalo by shooting them. One mixes their labor with the fish by catching them and hauling them off to market. There's little incentive to leave some buffalo or fish in the wild since there's nothing to stop somebody else from hauling off anything one leaves behind. So people haul off what they can grab when they can grab it until there's nothing left to take. I had an economics professor who illustrated this principle by scattering a number of quarters on the classroom floor. He then said that he would add a quarter for each quarter remaining on the floor after 1 minute. But somebody always started a mad scramble for quarters, and before the minute was up, all of the quarters had been claimed. Now one can say that this overuse involves a violation of Locke's proviso of leaving as much and as good for others, but complaining that somebody violated the proviso doesn't solve the problem. There's still the problem of who gets to enforce this limitation, and what gives them the authority to do so. Things in a state of nature are unowned. How does one go about assigning an authority to manage something that is unowned? The tragedy of the commons also applies to the sea as a dumping ground for waste, or to the air as a dumping ground for CO2. If one refrains from using these locations as a dumping ground for these waste products, well, there's always somebody else who can take up the slack. This leads to another problem with the Lockean theory. How does one capture wilderness values? Wilderness values are values that something may have in virtue of the fact that it's untouched by humans. It involves setting aside some place on land or in the water to be left alone. Recall that on Locke's account, one can't exclude other people from something in the state of nature until one owns it. and one can't own it until one has attached one's labor to it and, in doing so, removed it from the state of nature. The option of leaving something in the state of nature untouched and yet prohibiting others from taking any part of it isn't an option in the Lockean system. And finally, there are questions of how the Lockean system can handle rights with respect to property and ideas. The notion of intellectual property is grounded on the assumption that if we allow people to profit from innovation when they come up with new and original ideas, we will have more people investing more time and more money in coming up with new and original ideas. The overall result would be a benefit to humanity. But can we fit the notion of intellectual property into the Lockean system? The problem is that intellectual property can be copied and used without being taken. Consider the Lockean case of owning an apple. If one person harvests an apple and another person takes it, then the original owner is out of an apple. There's something the individual once had that the thief has taken. But imagine if it were possible, through some sort of magic, to turn one apple into two apples and then to take the second apple. This would leave the first apple with the original owner. What would be wrong with doing this? Intellectual property is like this. The person who takes intellectual property doesn't deprive the owner of what they have. They create a copy, and they make off with the copy. What the original owner loses in this case is the opportunity to sell the copies. If other people can simply take copies, then the original creator can't sell copies, whereas protecting the original creator's right to sell copies requires prohibiting others from taking copies. Now, what makes sense in the original Lockean system is the notion that it's wrong to have somebody labor to produce some good or service and then walk off with that good or service as if it's one's own. This amounts to something like enslavement of the original laborer. The wrongness of slavery consists in part in the wrongness of taking the fruits of somebody else's labor without their consent acquired through offering fair compensation. However, the Lockean system seems to leave a lot of questions unanswered. Now, one might be tempted to say that the right to property is not a natural right discovered by reason. Instead, it's a complex set of human conventions that ultimately aim to produce better lives for others. But if property can be taken to produce better lives for others, we must remember that the source of property is the life and liberty of individuals. And can that be taken to produce better lives for others?